Moving on to the next topic, which is about custody, which is about compliance, and which is about regulation. In particular, we're going to talk about FATF Recommendation 16, and we're going to have a panel around this topic. The panel will be moderated by Amy Davin Kim, Chief Policy Officer at the Chamber of Digital Commerce. And our panelists are the following. Mr. Michael Wu, founder and CEO of CoolBitX. Mr. Peter Di Miu, Global Sales Leader at Hyper Project Digital Assets at IBM. Mrs. Colleen Sullivan, Partner and CEO at CMT Digital. And Ulysse Del Orto, Managing Director at APAC Chainalysis. A big applause. Welcome our panelists.
What I mean is a mountain top that I'm dreaming of. If you need me, you know where I'll be. I'll be riding shotgun underneath the hot sun, feeling like a someone.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be here with you all this morning and talking about a topic that we all care about very much, anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist finance compliance, and what's going on at the international level with the FATF. Let me first allow each of our panelists to introduce themselves briefly.
Hi, everyone. I think it's still good morning. Peter DeMeo from IBM, and you're probably wondering what we're doing up here. I'm on the technology side of all of this. We build solutions to kind of look after the hot wallets out there, the cold wallets, and make them all warm or just temperature agnostic, actually. And so I work with clients that have to deal with this problem, and so I'll sort of take it from that practical perspective.
Hi, I'm Colleen Sullivan, CEO and co-founder of CMT Digital. We trade in the global crypto markets, spot and derivatives. We also have a venture investing team. We've invested in 22 companies in the blockchain crypto space, and then we do quite a bit of legal policy outreach.
Hi everyone, I'm Ulysse Del Orto, Managing Director, Asia Pacific at Chainalysis. So Chainalysis provides cryptocurrency investigations and compliance solutions for global law enforcement agencies, financial institutions, and cryptocurrency businesses that are interested in preventing money laundering or illicit activities. Some of you might have heard of the Welcome to Video Takedown, which was the biggest child pornography website in the world. It was taken down through Chainalysis solutions as well. Maybe we can talk about later.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael O, the founder and CEO of CoolBitX, starting in 2014. Our company fostered the mass adoption of virtual asset by providing security solutions and compliance solutions.
Thanks, everyone. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's been going on with the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, at the international level, and then unpack that a little bit to figure out what exactly that means, and then how different types of industries are going about complying with that. And I think it also, we'll talk a little bit about regionally too, what that means. So just to level set a little bit, what is the FATF? It's a multilateral governmental body that develops recommendations with respect to anti-money laundering or AML and counter-terrorist financing obligations. They do that as a way to develop policy objectives and then push those down to each of their member countries, which then becomes, in effect, a standard. And then they measure countries through examinations that occur periodically to determine if they're, in fact, complying with that. So they've been pretty active in this space. In 2014, they issued some key definitions around virtual currencies. In 2015, they issued some specific guidance looking at entry points and exit points into and out of the regulated financial system. And then in 2018, they introduced the concept of virtual asset and virtual asset service provider. And then in 2019, this summer, those recommendations were formally adopted. So first, let's just think about who we're talking about, who is going to be covered by this. What is a virtual asset service provider? Michael.
So virtual asset service providers basically include all the business entities that handle virtual assets for its customers, including custody services or crypto exchanges or brokerage services.
Yep.
Maybe I can also add to that. Recently, also FATF made sure to clarify that certain type of exchanges, that are not fiat to crypto exchanges, such as crypto to crypto exchanges or DEX, for example, are also part of the definition of virtual asset service providers. So that's very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty broad definition. It does reflect probably an enhancement in their understanding over the years. I think, as we all know, this technology changes pretty rapidly, so my hope is they consider that and maybe issue more guidance as we go forward. So let's think about then the process. What can we expect now that these recommendations have been adopted? Michael, do you want to kick off on that too? Maybe.
Yeah. Okay, so FATF announced this statement in October this year and giving each member country 12 months time to at least start looking into how to make some progress addressing these requirements, in particular the recommendation 16. Some of it's similar to the Bank Secrecy Act and travel rule. So as far as I know, the countries I've been to, the companies we've talked to, specifically in Asia, people are starting making progress and are looking into the challenges dealing with those requirements, and they are starting experimenting even how to solve those needs already. So for example, in Japan, in Taiwan, we can cover more details in the later questions.
Yeah, well, and let's kind of unpack that a little bit. So there is this expectation in the next year that countries will have developed some progress into issuing some recommendations to achieve compliance. So let's kind of combine the two then, who this covers and the establishment of new rules. Each of you kind of come from a different perspective in the industry. What do you each kind of see as some of the friction points or the challenges that the industry that you're, and the customer base that you each have will have in implementing this?
Okay, so I guess I could look at it from the perspective of banks, and the financial institutions that are implementing custody solutions, as well as lending and collateral and all kinds of different digital asset-based solutions that require assets to be either online or available at any time. Well, you can't onboard those assets unless they've gone through the AML CTF process, right? And so the practical problem that they face is like, well, how do you do that, right? Because as soon as you send the funds to, let's say, a set of wallets that you're going to do the AML checks on, they've technically hit the books. And if they are rejected, they're still on your books, and now you are in violation of perhaps any number of laws because you have, let's say, some funds that really shouldn't be there. So it creates this sort of like dilemma for banks and some friction, like, well, how do I do that? And so they have to then go create a whole other entity that basically does nothing but receive funds and go through the whole AML CTF process, and like with chain analysis, for example, or some others, and make sure that the rules are applied. So, for example, if it's you mentioned earlier SDN, right? It's a national that you shouldn't send money back to, right? But if they submitted the funds, presumably the people that would be submitting funds have been KYC'd and so forth. But just as an example, or maybe perhaps better example, you have a KYC ultra high net worth individual who's sending their funds to get custodied, but those funds came from maybe 3 or 4, revs back, an SDN or something like that. That should not pass. That should have a very high risk rating. Should not pass the checks. So what do you do with those funds? You have to return them, right? Or do you return them? Because if they're on a list, a blacklist, what's the rule?
Yeah, you got to freeze it. You have to freeze it and report it to OFAC within 10 days.
And that's just like a whole lot of hassle for these banks,
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. So just, Colleen, I'll turn it to you, because I think what you're getting at, too, is the technology isn't really built for this.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go. So one of the recommendations is application of the travel rule. And that makes a lot of sense in the context of traditional financial institutions like banks. In the case of wire transfers, you know that the receiver and the sender are both financial institutions, and there's technology built where you can send the identifying information required under the travel rule, so through something like Swift messaging. In contrast, you look at something like Bitcoin, and that doesn't exist. All you need for a transaction, of course, is just the sender's wallet address, the receiver's wallet address, and the amount. So this identifying information, name, birth date, that is not needed for the transaction. So now with these recommendations, VASPs are going to be required to obtain that information and to send it. So that the system is just not set up to do that right now.
Well, and right, they have to obtain it, hold it, and send it. So there is this kind of hold obligation, but right, the technology just doesn't have that functionality built in. And so I think to Peter's point, you have to build that layer on top of it, which banks, with, for the SWIFT system, I think is kind of the equivalent. That took potentially decades to perfect, and even has its own challenges, as we've seen. So.
Yeah, and to Peter's point, the assets that we're talking about are bearer instruments. So when you receive an asset and you're not supposed to accept it, whether the originator or beneficiary information is wrong or it's coming from a bad actor, you can't really just send it back. You don't know if that wallet can receive the funds back. You could lose the funds. It's not as straightforward as dealing with traditional assets.
Ulysses, what are you seeing as far as some of the friction points from your perspective as a kind of blockchain analytics?
Yeah, so you guys actually mentioned most of the most important points, but basically, like one of the major differences is that virtual service asset providers actually do not or are not able to make the distinction between a service and a personal wallet without specific technology. When it comes to the travel rule, I would say that we would need to look at it in like 3 pillars. So one is identification of the specific transactions that fall under the travel rules, the $1,000 threshold. The second one is collection, so collection of information that is KYC information of the user that are transacting. And the third one is transmission. Actually, the interesting thing is that the first 2 are actually achievable today. That is, there are technologies such as chainalysis, for example, when it comes to collection of information, that allow exchanges, for example, to identify services in the blockchain, and this is also something that can be done in real time. On top of that, we don't simply look at direct exposure, that is 1 hop away, we look at indirect exposure. That is, for example, a transaction that is 10 hops back or 20 hops back and is connected to illicit activities. So that's a very important point that we're trying to convey to the industry. 2 of the 3 pillars that are actually the requirements of FATF on the travel rule are actually achievable today. It's only the transmission part which is actually a bit more tricky. And this is where there are different solutions actually that are being discussed as we speak. And we don't believe that there is one solution fits all for all the cryptocurrency businesses in the space. It really depends on their business model and their jurisdiction in which they're operating. So it's a very interesting debate currently in the space.
Michael, maybe even about the solutions too that are out there.
Yes, to add on the third pillar, the data transmission across exchanges, we actually built a network called Signa that's currently being piloted by 10 exchanges in the mainstream exchanges. And what we do there is to build a JavaScript API service that allows one exchange to identify which counterparty exchange it's dealing with through a similar system with Swift code. We built something called Signa code for it. And then after identifying the counterparty exchange, there's a secure communication channel, a single point of contact. So all of the exchanges do not have to establish one separate communication channel with another 1,000 exchanges. That will consume too much of their time. So they all just need to talk to one single point, just pretty much like Swift. And however, there's one specific challenge I think the world is looking at right now. That is, how do you validate what kind of exchanges you can onboard to this kind of network? So for exchange, I mean, in the banking industry, obviously there's a global minimum standard how you become a legitimate bank and to be sharing your customer information with another bank in another country. Because a lot of times, for example, in Japan, those 20 licensed exchanges go through very strict criteria to get that licenses. And they are not comfortable to share their customer information with some exchange that's operated by 2 people located in somewhere you don't even heard the city before. The risk of that is they worry, what if after I transfer 500,000 customer profiles to that exchange and then it gets hacked? Or somehow it goes bankrupt, it sells all of those customer data to the public, to hackers, to bad actors. Whose responsibility is going to take? So I think right now, solution-wise, we've come to a conclusion that it can be solved. But the next question is, in each jurisdiction, how do we really validate the legitimacy of those exchange operations?
So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, which is you're thinking about data protection, really, right? Because you're sending out customer data. I mean, typically we're talking about name, potentially their date of birth, potentially some type of identifying number, like a tax identifier number, account number, things like that. And it sounds like you've developed a closed kind of system so that people, the participants in it, the businesses, the exchanges, know the counterpart. But I think as we're implementing this, as this rule is implemented internationally, we need to be careful about forcing compliance before we know where that information is going. For protection, it may be going to a country that doesn't value data protection potentially as much as others, or even you might not send it to a non-VASP, just a wallet that's not associated with an exchange. So it's a interesting, just good to hear how you guys are building that into your solution.
So I could just kind of, is anybody from R3 here? Huh? Maybe they should be. I think this is a permission blockchain problem, and it's a good use case.
Well, you think it's kind of, Swift, really kind of developed, but that's a solution that took
Well, that's
decades.
a Swift solution, but I'm thinking more in terms of this is a good use case for permission versus permissionless blockchain or public blockchains, where everybody, is known to a closed consortium network, okay? And so everyone has to KYC. In fact, you could have a shared KYC. And everyone's data, of course, has their own ledger, just, typical blockchain stuff. By the way, IBM has this technology. When you're operating in a permission blockchain, there's a network operator, and if you have a situation where there's a breach and so forth, you can kind of deal with that a little bit better than just being on your own and so forth. And you can make the transactions a lot faster because everyone's known to each other. So you've actually solved for not only the originator and the destination, know who they are, but the communications are all done as well in an encrypted format as well.
So I think you're touching on kind of the second challenge. One that we've just talked about is the technological challenge, where the underlying technology, let's take the Bitcoin blockchain, for example, wasn't designed to capture or understand this information. Mm-hmm. The second is, as we're building technological solutions, what's the governance structure going to look like? And is it a single solution that's being built, or might there be multiple players in this space? Any thoughts on that? I know this is a tough issue.
Well, on the permission blockchain, governance is a big part of that, right? So you have a consortium, and they come up with the rules: who are members, who are not members, how do you stay a member, what kind of fee structures there are, and then what is the rules around GDPR compliance and all the various equivalents all over the place, right? So personal data protections and things of that nature. When you're dealing with consortia at this point, even a huge consortia of literally thousands of nodes, which would be different exchanges, right? At least you have a shot at it. Of course, the downside to this, all of the crypto purists out there would say this is a total, what's the word I'm trying to think of? The opposite of what we're, it's not decentralized. It's a permission blockchain, right? So
so kind of picking up on that, I don't think the industry was necessarily surprised by most of the FATF recommendations. I think the travel rule I would put in a bit of a different category, because we're starting to get sort of farther away from the whole purpose of this technology. I don't know if there is time or opportunity for the industry to kind of come together and try to push back a little bit on this. And are there other ways to tackle this, just given that the digital asset technology is not built to sort of exchange that kind of information. The mechanisms just aren't there. Certainly solutions can be built, but they're not inherent to these protocols. Would it be better to have more robust KYC, AML? We've also got these public blockchains that don't exist with traditional wire transfers. And with firms like Chain Analysis, you can do the analytics on the chain for purposes of trying to discover illicit activity. So I just wonder if there's other ways to tackle this.
Because, I mean, the thing about that is it's after the fact.
Yeah.
We're talking you need to prevent.
Well, I'm still all
yeah.
for like KYC, AML up front. It's just the travel rule that I think is tricky.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, and it does, and maybe Ulysses, you'd like to speak to this point, which is it does kind of ignore the advances that we've developed with this technology to create better KYC systems, for example, or transaction monitoring. I think both of you have kind of developed systems that could actually benefit and maybe enhance AML compliance even more than we have today.
Yeah, and I think that, like some of the biggest exchanges in the world, for example, are they already have KYC in place, they already have a transaction monitoring that doesn't have to be reactive, but actually proactive. So I can give you an example. If I'm a user of a cryptocurrency exchange and I want to make a withdrawal request to send funds to a darknet market, for example, or a ransomware address, if Chainalysis has identified this address or this darknet market, the exchange, so the virtual asset service provider, will be able to stop this transaction in real time. So it'll be a prevention in real time. So there's a lot of these things that are not always discussed. This is why we're doing, for example, a lot of educational workshops in Japan and Hong Kong to make sure that regulators, cryptocurrency businesses, financial institutions, and all the different stakeholders are speaking the same language.
I think let's take a step back and take a look at the overall mission of FATF. Ultimately, what they want to achieve is stop the money laundering, the financial crimes, and why they apply travel rule to VASPs now and potentially to even non-custodial wallets later, like FINMA did a couple months ago. I think ultimately it all leads to stopping all the loopholes that can potentially leak the funds to terrorists or bad actors, drug lords. I think Chainalysis built a great product that an analytical tool does help a lot. And however, I think there's one missing puzzle. That's why FATF is trying to put a plug on the hole. That is, let's say there are some bad actors create some new addresses not associated with any data in your analytical results. And then people started to transfer funds to those new addresses, and those addresses can actually send to anywhere, any other address they want to. You don't even know who the next stop is. It's not possible to identify that way.
Actually, so there are a couple of things that we do already now and we have in our software. So we have, for example, a feature called the watch feature, which allows cryptocurrency businesses to basically focus on a specific address and get notified whenever there are transfers that are coming in, transfers are coming out, and where these transfers are linked to illicit or illicit activities. And an important thing is that, everything is going through a REST API. So if I'm a chief compliance officer of an exchange, I make one API call, and automatically I'm going to get updates on the riskiness of addresses or users. So actually there are ways to do this. Obviously, maybe we do not have the information right away, but the information will be provided to the virtual asset service provider as soon as we identify these addresses or these services behind the addresses. But there are ways to automate the entire process. But I agree that we're still at an infancy stage when it comes to the technology.
Well, and I guess to Michael's point too, I think law enforcement's challenge was identifying a real person to a wallet, and they're trying. This is a very direct way to achieve that. Granted, though, that there are technological advancements that can help you to discern that information. But think about then, now we're in this situation where we have to obtain this information. So now, what are the kind of custody and security considerations when you're holding that, Peter?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that when I think about custody 2.0 and what's happening out there, certainly there's a migration from just pure cryptocurrencies to really any kind of token you can come up with. And then you want to be able to go from purely holding it in cold storage where a human is involved and you have the risk of a human memorizing a key or something to that effect, or it just simply takes a long time to do a transaction, to on demand. Well, when you have any token on demand, right, then you need to put a lot of policy around that, so that way you can make sure that the transactions, in fact, someone's going to look at it, right? And this is kind of what you guys were talking earlier. You could, for example, on a hot wallet, you could put countermeasures and say, okay, right, for this profile, they make these kinds of trades, and if I'm seeing something out of band, I might want to go send an email to various people to make sure that, in fact, this is a legitimate transaction, right? So that, maybe that's a case of a hacker coming in and doing something bad. But you could also come up with other kinds of policies that would maybe then, check like the blacklist for, counterterrorism or something like that, right? Ironically, making all these things a little bit more centralized. But the point being is that that's the trade-off, right? I mean, as you mature this market, you want all these people to come in, institutional money to come into digital assets. You got to play by the rules at the end of the day.
And I think that it's important to leave some room for customizing these specific alerts that they were mentioning. Because, for example, you might need to deal with a business, a cryptocurrency business, a virtual asset service provider who's based in a jurisdiction where certain categories of services might not be seen as illicit. So gambling, for example, illicit in certain jurisdictions, illicit in other jurisdictions. So you need to be able to customize that. And it's very important to provide the flexibility to receive alerts, like based on, is it a direct exposure, is it indirect exposure, is it linked to OFAC addresses, is it linked to ransomware? And so this is something that is already possible. And it's actually customizable based on the jurisdiction and the type of risk appetite of the business.
I think that, from what I'm seeing, as exchanges become more regulated, they're going to get custody. Whether they do it themselves or they're going to get a third party, right? And it's going to be the custodians, especially when it comes to multi-custodian settlement for transactions, that I think will be sort of like where a lot of this happens in the future, and they'll just sort of take care of it on behalf of their different stakeholders, with their exchanges, whether they're banks, whether they're, any type of digital asset token platform, hedge funds, what have you.
The interesting thing too is, so we've kind of blended a couple concepts here, but just to kind of back up just a little, we talked about OFAC or OFAC being a U.S. Sanctions agency, so sanctions, we've talked about blacklists. Those things exist and continue to exist regardless of what happens here with respect to what we're talking about with FATF and AML or the travel rule and whether it applies or not, which is still, but it too presents the same challenges of knowing the counterparties to a transaction when you're dealing with a technology that doesn't inherently obtain that information or share it. So let me just, since we're here in Singapore, what is the perspective from Asia? How are regulators in Asia addressing the adoption of these types of rules? Michael, do you want to take that first?
In Japan and in Taiwan, regulators are talking actively with SROs, self-regulatory organizations, and the private sectors, mostly exchanges to begin with, since they are probably the largest VASPs with the most amount of user base. So they begin with them. And what they are asking the private sector to work together now is to take a look at the FATF Recommendation 16, because the authorities, the regulators are required to implement some legislation sometime next year. And they don't want to come out with a finalized legislation that the industry simply have no capability to comply with, and which might just kill the industry. So no government wants to do that. That's why they are already given time and hints to the private sector on let's work together, show me some progress, show me some test results, and let's see what kind of reasonable legislation should come along with.
I think, you know, Hong Kong just passed the regulations, what, a week ago? And for all the exchanges, right? And Singapore, we expect to happen here in, you know, the first part of next year.
Yeah. So actually, I was in Hong Kong 2 weeks ago and then Tokyo last week. So one important thing to keep in mind is that the mutual evaluations are starting from Asia as well. So that's also why these jurisdictions are being very proactive when it comes to addressing the requirements established by FATF. In general, like from what we've seen, Asia has been very, very proactive. In other jurisdictions, we've seen a lot of wait-and-see approach, looking at larger regulators, for example, in the US, looking at what they're doing and then replicating that in their jurisdiction. But you know, Hong Kong has officially set up their requirements. The SFC has done that. MAS has been very, very proactive, very interested in understanding what technologies are necessary to comply with some of these requirements. So Asia is definitely doing a lot of interesting work.
And I'll just add, I can't speak specific to the Asian regulatory component, but one of the things that we find interesting is that with the FATF recommendations, in theory, it should at least lessen some of the regulatory arbitrage that we've seen. So in the exchange space specifically, we've seen certain crypto-only exchanges really sort of achieve unfettered growth by staying outside of the banking system. These new FATF recommendations will capture those kind of exchanges, crypto-to-crypto transactions. So, you know, it should level the playing field from that standpoint, hopefully. But, I mean, it does, I guess, bear saying that these FATF recommendations will be implemented jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and how jurisdictions implement the recommendations will differ. So we talked about, you know, what's a virtual asset, and it includes consumptive utility tokens, payment tokens, and how jurisdictions sort of cover those things, non-fungible tokens, to the extent they're tradable and transferable, sort of remains to be seen.
So kind of our last question, and kind of tying in what you just said about leveling the playing field, the U.S. held the presidency for the FATF last year until June. They were a key driver because the U.S. believes that the has wire transfer rules on its books already, wanted to kind of push that out globally. Now we have a new presidency at the FATF, which is China. Any kind of perspectives on how, you know, what we might see, you know, going forward during their presidency?
Digital renminbi. That's what you're going to see.
And then they comply with the FATF wire transfer rule?
For sure. That's like a highly centralized, you know, digital currency, right? That's going to have all the rules built in. It's not going to be decentralized. It's not going to be like Bitcoin. Yeah. So I actually think that will be a good example of how it will be done, because governance is going to be a big part of that.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, I cannot speak on behalf of what the new president of FATF will do, but I think it's important for the entire space to work towards the current recommendations, because you guys, we are very familiar with that China banned the crypto exchange business in China, and we definitely don't want them to enforce even more harsh, more restrictive recommendations to all FATF member countries. Mm-hmm. So I think by showing some progress, it's a good gesture of we looking at this AML altogether, rather than they think, no, this industry is still too much dirty money, not making progress towards more regulatory movement, then just kill the industry. We definitely want to avoid that.
I think certainly we want kind of a level-handed approach, and perhaps that what they announced in October, that they're going to be examining for this, seems to be kind of staying the course.
Yeah, I was going to say, in Thailand, you know, the SEC kind of leveled the playing field earlier this year when they said, okay, if you're not an approved exchange, then you're not in business anymore, right? And then, of course, even of the small list, I think at the time 4 exchanges, the biggest one went out of business. I think it was BX, I think. And the reason they went out of business was because of the compliance to all of the paperwork, essentially, and the reporting and the auditing and all of it. It was too much. And so they just said, you know what, we're done. And so it leveled the playing field. Now they have like BitCub, which is basically running the show. Satang is the other one that they're a little bit smaller. But it's like, so in a way, it did level, but then it went one step further with all of the, the compliance aspects that really kind of drove up, if you will, the friction to the point where it just wasn't worth it anymore.
Well, maybe that's kind of the point we should end on, which, colleague, I think you and I have discussed this. Having industry involved in this conversation is important, not only to enhance, I think, AML compliance objectives, but also to ensure, I think, Michael, that they can comply with it, and that we don't put, stifle or stymie the growth of this business altogether.
Completely agree. Yeah, I mean, we really want the industry to lead as best as it can and help inform the regulators as they're trying to implement these new recommendations. Great.
Well, thank you, everyone. I couldn't think of a better panel of experts than these to speak about these issues, so I really appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.